Welcome to this special launch day episode of Talking Sock. In part one of this 2-episode interview, I am joined by a true Australian treasure.
That's really how I started working with the shadow puppets.
World-renowned shadow puppeteer Richard Bradshaw. In this episode, we look at Richard's time spent with Jim Henson and Caroll Spinney, as well as his career as artistic director of the Marionette Theatre of Australia.
He had extraordinary energy.
Join Richard and I now, here on Talking Sock. So Richard, welcome and thank you. We are so excited to have you here on Talking Sock. How you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Yes.
It's so nice to have you here. I need to ask you the question I ask all my guests, and that first question is, why puppets?
Well, it's interest in theatre, really. Wanting to act, particularly when I was at school, in primary school. With puppets, one can act the whole show by oneself. And I suppose that's why I started doing some puppets, even before I went to Clovelly Puppet Theatre. I would have probably, at the time that I joined Clovelly Puppet Theatre, preferred to have joined a drama group. I don't regret having joined the Clovelly Puppet Theatre because it's enabled me to do my own shows my own way. So I've enjoyed doing the puppet thing, but still did quite a lot of acting when I was at university and after that when I was teaching.
Tell us about the Clovelly Puppet Theatre as sort of, was it the origin of your puppet sort of world, or was there a moment before Clovelly that you knew that puppetry was your thing?
It would have been really nurtured at Clovelly. What happened was that I went to what was called an opportunity class in Kensington, public school. There was a guy there who was a year ahead of me, Arthur Cantrell. We became quite good friends, and Arthur went to Sidney High a year ahead of me, and he had started going to Clovelly Puppet Theatre. And it was a suggestion from him that I might go along there. Now, it coincided with a visit of the Hogarth Puppets from England, with Jan Bustle and his wife Anne and their daughter Sally. A month or so after I'd joined Clovelly, they were in Australia. I didn't meet them, but I went to see a show that they did at the huge Empire Theatre that used to be near Railway Square. And it seated about 2,500. It was arranged, the show was organised by Joan and Betty Rayner of the Australian Children's Theatre, and they had said to Jan and Anne, we'd only sell 700 seats, but a huge number of people turned up.
Oh!
And I was one of the last, so I was in the very back row of the theatre looking at these tiny puppets in the distance. So I did see a sort of show, but I later found out from Jan that they were very unhappy about the size of that audience.
Oh dear. Wow. In the Clovelly Puppet Theatre, how many years were you there for? What was the sort of time frame? And what was it like? What was it like to have a puppet theatre, in Eastern Sydney?
Well, it was an interesting thing. It was an old tin hut, an army hut, corrugated iron, which got very hot in the summer months. So we only played there in the cooler months. So it usually began after Easter. It did a show every Saturday afternoon. There'd be 4 or 5 little glove puppet plays, which were different from week to week, followed by a marionette show, which usually ran for 3 weeks or so, and then there'd be a circus on, a marionette circus once a month. This was all organised by Edith Murray. The Clovelly Puppet Theatre was part of the Children's Library and Crafts movement, which later became the Creative Leisure movement. It had been started by 2 sisters, Mary Matheson and Elsie Rivette. There were other puppet theatres. It wasn't just Clovelly. Edith also had a puppet theatre at Bradfield Park, which was it's now East Linfield, but it was a migrant camp at the time, mainly for British migrants.
Wow.
And there was another one, well, it was just a puppet theatre, a glove puppet theatre, I think at Phillip Park, which is near St Mary's Cathedral. There was a centre there, a library, a Children's Creative Leisure Movement Centre. And at Erskineville, there were actually 2 puppet theatres, one which was already there when I joined Clovelly, and then there was another building where they built a new theatre that could be used for glove puppets and marionettes. That was in Prospect Street, Erskineville. So there were two of these centres in Erskineville, which was then a rather depressed area. It's very different now.
Yes, very different now. You've just mentioned sort of 5 or 6 puppet theatres that all exist within a very small area of Sydney. And as a young person who, is desperately trying to access more puppetry in Australia, the idea that there was so many puppet theatres in Sydney kind of astounds me. I'm really interested to know what happened to all these little theatres, and what do you think changed in Australian culture that let puppetry theatres sort of go?
I think probably a very big change was television, which was 1956, and we're talking about the years just before that. The Puppetry Guild of New South Wales, which started just after Clovelly Puppet Theatre began, had a large number of people, many of them school teachers. And so you could get as many as 100 at an event if there were visiting puppeteers. It was also a very good time to be starting off in puppetry. In 1953, the year after I joined Clovelly, 2 American puppeteers came, Walton and O'Rourke, who were quite brilliant.
Wow.
Ronnie Burkett is very jealous of me because I saw these perform, and there doesn't seem to be much video of their work. They made puppets for a film called Lily with Leslie Caron, based on Love of 7 Dolls, and these were glove puppets, brilliantly animated glove puppets, but that wasn't what Walton and O'Rourke specialised in. They specialised in marionettes. There was one puppet which really bowled me over, and I still remember it as a wonderful figure, Madam Birmingham Buzzbottom.
What a great name.
And she came into the theatre. It was open stage, so you saw the puppeteers, and she eyed the audience through her lorgnette and waved at various people, and then sat down and ordered a drink from the other puppeteer who acted as a waiter. And the first drink she got, she sipped through a straw and spat out. You actually saw the spit go across the stage, and said, "What is this stuff? Formaldehyde? I came here to be pickled, not embalmed."
That's fantastic. Wow.
And then finally she got so pissed, really, that she had to be carried off the stage by her seat. And as she was carried off, she sang, "I wish all the men were like bulls in the pasture and I was the cow that made them go faster."
Oh, my goodness.
So I was 15 and delighted by this. And they did a return season, and so I saw them again. But they came to a Puppetry Guild meeting. They were wonderful characters. Their puppet show still stands out for me as one of the brilliant marionette shows.
Unreal. And is this sort of the foundation of all these different puppet theatres and things that you saw as a member of the Puppetry Guild, but also moving around those puppet theatres in Sydney? Did you actively seek out these sort of experiences?
Clovelly was the only one that was really regular, and then there were occasional shows done at these other theatres.
Yes.
So it was just being part of the Clovelly community that got me involved, through Edith Murray.
So I want to ask, because I want to know how you and where you get your ideas from. Many of your shadow vignettes are filled with these really great gags of visual humour. And I'd love to kind of ask about your advice on comic timing with that as well. But I want to know where these ideas come from. I remember, the David being sculpted by the sculptor, and before David kicks him off as he's, sculpting his funny bone. I remember the ostrich. I remember the hippo on the tightrope from the early Playschool days. So these ideas of what shadow puppetry is and can be for me are very much like founded in what you did. I want to know where those ideas came from.
I think we should go back to how I started doing these funny things, because when I started with shadow puppets, we were strongly influenced by a production that the Bustles had brought, the Hogarth Puppets, when they came to Australia. I didn't see it, but it was using puppets by Lotte Reiniger, who made all those wonderful stop-action films using silhouettes. And she made the first full-length animated film in 1923 to 26, Prince Ahmed, The Adventures of Prince Ahmed. And so these were quite exquisite figures, and they did an Oscar Wilde story, The Happy Prince. Yes. Now, as I said, I didn't see that. I did eventually see it from behind. And then there was one of the adults that came to Clovelly Puppet Theatre, Isabel Ferguson, decided to do another Oscar Wilde story using shadow puppets, and that was The Nightingale and the Rose. And Arthur Cantrell, my school friend, made most of the puppets, and I sort of did technical things for it and helped manipulate it. And so at the time we thought shadow puppets for serious, poetic sort of plays. And the first play I did with shadow puppets was while I was teaching. I was living in a boarding school at Cranbrook School in Sydney and couldn't make glove puppets or marionettes because I'm a messy person and it wasn't the place to make a mess. But I could cut out bits of cardboard, and so that's really how I started working with the shadow puppets, which I eventually found was my métier. But what I did was Orpheus and the Underworld, and I got some of the kids to help me, and I did a show for the Puppetry Guild at Erskineville. It wasn't wonderful. And I don't think I would have necessarily got on with shadow puppets, but Edith was giving a talk at Skeggs Girls' School in Darlinghurst about different kinds of puppets, and she didn't have a shadow puppet, and so she asked me to make one. And I made an old man that tapped at a rock, and the rock turned into a monster. And I performed this for her when she was giving her talk, and there was a mighty laugh from the girls in the audience. And I thought, oh, that's the way to go with shadow puppets. So that was the beginning of my doing humorous things with puppets, and I haven't done many serious things with them since. You say, where do I get the ideas? Often it's beginning with a simple idea. For instance, with a camel, it's the idea of the hump falling through, and then building up round that. And sometimes it'll develop into a longer item, sometimes it'll be very short. So the statue, it's the thinker, incidentally, not David. There's statue kicking away the sculptor lasts, 20 seconds, I think. And other things will last much longer. The story of the ostrich on the tightrope and the hippo and the mouse is interesting. In fact, they were two separate items. There was the ostrich on the tightrope, and it was the ostrich that came down and collapsed the tightrope originally. And then there was the hippo and the mouse on the seesaw. And John Fox from the ABC, who wanted to do this for Playschool, came and suggested, can't you combine these? And so I thought, let's do 3 parts with the 3 animals. And so we introduced the slide, that was a bit new, and then use the 3 animals on each. So it was the hippo that ends up collapsing everything in that one.
Which is the gag in 3s, effectively, that beautiful rule of...
3 is a wonderful number, yes.
Of comedy,
Yes. And in timing, when you say that timing 3 is very important, you do things once, twice, and the third thing is the novel one.
Yes. What other advice would you give to puppeteers or theatre makers on comic timing? How have you developed your comic timing?
Listening to the audience. The nice thing about doing things that get a laugh is that you can measure how successful you are, especially if you're behind a screen, as I am, and can't see the audience. So the only feeling I get from them, I don't believe in mental telepathy, is the sounds they're making. Silence is very good, but when you're doing something funny, laughter is good. And so for me, the best time in learning the craft was when I was doing the school shows for Joan and Betty Rayner in 1969-70, because I was playing to, I think, 7 audiences a week on average, and trying to get the laugh right, trying to get the time right. And those 2 years were very important for me. I remember when I started being, of course, very nervous taking the show out. It was in Gippsland. And it was about the 3rd week that I suddenly felt on top of the audience and felt that I was controlling them and getting the laughter I wanted from them as if I'm working on them. Now, even today, that doesn't always work. And I remember when I was touring in Spain with Geordie, who was the driver, I had to write French for him, and he answered by spoken French because he had no common language otherwise. There were a couple of times when the show just worked very well for me, and he would say at the end, Mr. Bradshaw. But it doesn't always work, and you're working all the time to try to get it right.
So there's just a sense of just practice and practice and practice until you find that moment where you're in your control of it. And I love the when you say, hearing the audience and listen to the audience's silence, but there is not telepathy, Matt, but there is an energy that the live audience brings that you share with the audience in the theatre. And particularly for you being behind that screen and being so invisible to them, how do you share that energy with your audience and how have you experienced it over time? Has it changed from the early days to now?
I don't think it's changed all that much. It's sometimes I imagine the audience as being one large person sitting there. As I say, I am working with the audience. I'm part of the audience in a way. I'm sharing their experience because I am seeing the show that they're seeing. But that's one of the nice things about shadow puppets. It's not the case with the other forms of puppets. I'm seeing pretty much what they're seeing, but I'm seeing the sticks and rods as well.
Yes.
So that's rather nice that we're sharing the same visual thing.
Yeah, it's a lovely thought of sharing something as opposed to putting something in front of an audience just to beg for their applause, I guess. You were featured on The Muppet Show in Season 1, and I believe there is a very special frog-related gift to remind you of that moment. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'll give you the full story there. Jim Henson had first seen my show at the UNIMA Festival in Charleville in 1972, which became a very important festival because after that Charleville became the headquarters, Charleville-Mézières in France became the headquarters of UNIMA, and it hadn't been until then. But that's where I met Jim, and he liked the show. And I have a letter there which you can look at later, long letter that I got. It came out of the blue from him and said how nice it was to meet and see a shadow puppet show that worked, or words to that effect.
Wow.
And he had suggested that I might come across to New York, and they were working on a stage show with the Muppets and wondered whether I might help him with shadows. In fact, I don't think I could have done a very good job for the illustrations, the wonderful illustrations that he sent, but they were not black silhouettes, they were coloured.
Yes.
And that would have been a problem for me, animating them. But anyway, the show didn't happen. And then he heard that I was going to the festival in Moscow 4 years later in 1976 and said, we're starting a little show, we call it a series, we're calling it The Muppet Show. We think it might be successful. Something like that.
Just maybe.
And we're filming it in England. That's because he couldn't get support in the States.
Really?
Yes. None of the networks would take it up. He wanted a prime time slot. They didn't want it. So it was Lou Grade in London that put up the money from ITV. It was recorded in London, and Jim said, can you come by London, after Moscow? And so that's what happened. And they only finished 3 shows at that time, the first 3 shows, and the guest star would be flown over. I didn't meet a guest star, but I was on the set while they were recording, so it was a wonderfully happy set, very funny. Lots of things went wrong when they were recording. They were, of course, really funny bits that the audience didn't see. Yeah. And at the end of the recording, Jim gave me a little silver Kermit, which I can't show you because I've taken it to Sidney because we were worried that bushfires might hit us, and so we took a certain number of valuables down to Sidney, and that was one of the things. It was the one that he was wearing that he gave me, so wow. It's a nice sort of contact. At the end of the Russian festival, I was to fly from Moscow airport to Heathrow, and the puppets were supposed to be put on the plane with me. And when we got to the airport, the puppets were not there. And my interpreter queued to telephone the theatre, so we had to wait till she got up to the phone, and the puppets were still there. So, and these were the days where things often went missing with Russian airlines.
Oh, God.
Too confident. So I waited and waited, and then someone said, they're calling your plane. So I had to go up without the puppets. But just as I went up the stairs, and I still have this memory, they came rushing in out of the rain with the cases, everybody dripping. As I got onto the plane, a large Russian man said, your cases, gave me the tickets for them. When I got to London, they didn't come off the plane. I was waiting and waiting.
Oh, my God.
Until everybody collected their suitcases. My personal suitcase was there, but the puppets weren't. Eventually, I just had to go out of the airport without the puppets. There was a car waiting, a much smaller car than could have taken the puppets. And I had a note, did I want to go and stay with the Bussells or stay with Jim? And so I went up and stayed with Jim, because that seemed the obvious thing for a week.
Wow.
So I had a wonderful week in London. The puppets did arrive. They had been there, but they still had the Qantas labels on them. So they went to Qantas and they agreed to send them to the studio at no extra cost. So, in fact, it turned out very well.
Oh, very nice. I want to ask about your week with Jim, or however long you stayed with Jim for. I mean, people revere Jim, and everyone has a different experience and story about Jim. And can you tell us a bit about who the man of Jim was?
Well, I made a mistake of the date. I think I said that Russian one was in 74. It was in 76.
Okay.
So I have to correct me. Because 74 was when I did shows at Bill Baird's Theatre in New York. And Jim invited me to have the weekend with the family. And so after work on Friday, he drove me up to their place in Greenwich. So that's really where I got to know him better. He was a very pleasant, easygoing guy. He had it all together, as you might say.
Yeah.
He knew exactly what he was doing, but he had extraordinary energy. And I've heard a story from one of the people that worked with him when they were working on Fraggle Rock, and one of the puppeteers said, Jim, we've been working hours and hours, we're all exhausted. And he just didn't hear that, because he was never exhausted. He didn't tire. So there was enormous energy and enormous talent, of course. I liked him very much, felt it was a great friendship. I've got a wonderful letter there saying, I've been carrying around this letter from you for the last year, but now that it's a year's gone by, it seems time to answer. So how the hell are you? It was a great friendship. I was really devastated when he died. I was in Toronto doing shows. When the news came, Margaret told me on the phone, because I'd phoned here and she'd found out before I did. And there was to be a memorial service on the Monday in New York, and it was very quickly organised. I'd been with Lou Curtin in Seattle. She was visiting her son there. She's from New York, and she was the UNIMA General Secretary, and she had to fly back to talk at this memorial service, which is a very moving service. I've seen video of it. But I wanted to send some flowers, and I went to a florist in the basement of the York Hotel and said, I want these to go to the church on Monday. And the girl said, but it's a public holiday on Monday. And I said, it's not a public holiday in New York. And she said, they don't celebrate the Queen's birthday in New York?
And talking about Jim and the Muppets and the incredible cast of talent that is the Muppet family, in December last year, we sadly lost a great puppetry legend called Caroll Spinney, who was the puppeteer behind Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch. And I know that you've met Caroll, and I'd love if you could also share with us some of your memories with Caroll. And I heard that you went to a party that he organised once that was quite something.
Well, I said I spent a weekend with Jim and the family. What happened was that on the Saturday we drove up to Caroll's place, which was in Woodstock, but not Woodstock of music fame, Woodstock in Connecticut, up near the border of Massachusetts. And on the way we called at Rufus Rose's house. Rufus was quite a well-known puppeteer, and there's the Rufus and Margot Rose Theatre at the O'Neill Centre now.
Gosh.
And Rufus came up to the party with us, and it was by a large pool, a pond, where people were swimming, and it was a very pleasant afternoon. And I took a photo of Jim and Caroll. And when he died, I sent a copy of that photo to Nancy Staub, and she said, "You should send this to Cheryl." So I sent it to Cheryl Henson. And last Sunday week, I think, we got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to watch the memorial service for Caroll. It was, I was told, I was asked not to publicise the live stream of this. But to my amazement, Cheryl mentioned that very photo during the ceremony. It's a photo of Jim with Caroll, but it's a very relaxed photo. I caught up with Caroll again later that visit to the States, because after New York I did shows in Kentucky and at the Australian Embassy in DC. And then the last bit was a festival in New Orleans. And before my show, which was the last thing at the festival, Caroll and a magician named J. Marshall imitated the Sicilian puppets that we'd seen earlier in the week, and they'd dressed themselves in armour made from alfoil and were fighting in swords, and I was behind my screen watching their shadows and seeing them come very close to the screen and bumping the screen at one stage, and I thought, oh, here we go. But it was very funny. Caroll was the MC for that festival, and he had a puppet called Pickle Puss. This is what Jim had seen early on at the Puppeteers of America festival, and apparently at that particular performance things went very wrong for Pickle Puss, and Caroll was not particularly happy, and nevertheless Jim said, "I'd like you to come along and work with us." And he found his niche with those two characters, Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch. He wasn't so hot with the other Muppets apparently, but those two really became his. At this festival in New Orleans, he began with a cat puppet that appeared above the screen. It had animated features, eyes, and the audience seemed to be a bit restless. And Caroll said, "Yeah, that's what I thought," and produced the original Pickle Puss, which is a much simpler puppet, but much better. It's a great lesson that simplicity is often more successful in puppetry than the complicated figure.
Interesting. Wow. We're going to take a little break. You are listening to Talking Sock with One Orange Sock and Richard Bradshaw. We'll be right back after the break. Make sure you hit subscribe and follow at One Orange Sock Productions on Instagram, and we'll be back with Richard shortly.
This is Philip Miller.
I'm Richard Bradshaw.
I'm Sue Wallace, and you are listening to
Talking Sock.
Talking Sock Podcast.
A One Orange Sock production.
This is the #1 podcast for puppetry in the country.
Your one-stop shop for all things puppetry arts and practitioners.
The #1 puppetry podcast in Australia.
Follow this podcast.
Welcome back. You are listening to Talking Sock with Pete Davidson and Richard Bradshaw. We've been talking about a whole legacy of puppet magic from the Clovelly Puppet Theatre to Henson and beyond. Let's continue the conversation. So, Richard, I wanted just to go back to your story with Caroll Spinney at that fateful party. I need people to hear this side of the story. I think it's so brilliant. Can you tell us what happened after? Obviously, that was that moment, the wonderful photo. But tell us about how they let you go, how they saw you off.
Night was falling, and I'd had a glass or two of wine, and I started to seeing these little lights all around me, and I thought perhaps I've had too much wine, but they were lightning bugs, which are quite wonderful. I've now seen flocks of them. I don't know if they're flocks, with these masses they're fireflies.
Fireflies, yes.
Yes, when one landed on me, I realised that I wasn't imagining things. But I was in the car, I think there was Jane and young Heather, who was about 3 years old, Brian and John, and outside the window were Jim Henson, Caroll, and Frank Oz.
Oof.
Frank Oz was going to travel with us back to Connecticut. They said goodbye to each other as the light was fading, and they said it in the voices of Bert and Ernie and Big Bird.
Oh.
And I couldn't believe that this was really happening, that I was hearing this. But anyway, the trip back was rather eventful because as we drove away, a light came on in the car, which was a Jaguar station wagon, and said, "Stop the engine." And we'd run out of water. The radiator was apparently leaking.
Oh.
So we went into a very silent sort of town. I think everybody was in bed, wondering where we might find water. And we came to a cemetery, and Jim, Brian and I went looking with a container for water in the cemetery. While we were doing that, a police car came along and wondered what we were doing. And when we said what it was, he said, "I'll get back in the car, I'll take you to the station." So we were in the back of this police car, and that's when I found out you can't open the door of a police car from inside, because for obvious reasons. And he wired through, we've got 3 495s in the back or something like that. And
There's a code for you. Puppeteers in the back seat of a police car has a code.
Exactly. And we picked up the water at the station, and he drove us back and put it in the car. And we set off again, and once again, the light came up, stopped the engine.
No.
So we found a service station. This is after midnight now, where they were able to work on it for about an hour. It was the first time I had clam chowder, and that was quite wonderful because we had to fill in time waiting. Then, in the early hours of the morning, we got back to Greenwich, and when we went into the house, the basement was flooding and was still being filled by water from a leaking pipe. And Jim had collected a number of imitation Muppet figures made out of plastic that people were trying to sell, because they had a lawyer full-time to try to stop this sort of thing. And he had this collection. They were all floating around in the basement.
Dead bodies.
And Jim and Frank had to get up at about 5 o'clock because they were flying to San Francisco to see the Muppets on Ice, or Sesame Street on Ice, something like that. I was able to bind around the pipe with tape until there was so much tape around it that it leaked no more, and so the water at least stopped coming into the basement. But that was quite eventful.
Horrific evening
Yes.
after such a lovely day. Gosh. And they made their flight, obviously.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
They'd gone by the time I woke up.
So we've just been in the break having a look at your letters from Jim Henson over the years, and you mentioned that you, in 1972, went to the UNIMA Congress in Charleville-Mézières, which is after Jim's visit, apparently where the headquarters of UNIMA then remained to be. After meeting Henson, what did that mean for your career internationally and here in Australia?
Well, just meeting him didn't mean anything. I think really it wasn't till I did the Muppet thing that it was really valuable for my career. That because I don't know if you've seen the clip, but Kermit introduces me as being from Australia,
Yes.
and so it was very nice publicity to have. We certainly used it for a number of shows here. After we started the Rocks Theatre in Sydney, Jim visited Australia. I didn't know he was coming.
Yes.
I got a telephone call saying, this is Jim and I'm at the Hyatt. And visiting, I think it's probably to do with Fraggle Rock, I'm not sure. I think they were trying to promote it. But he came along to the building which was being gutted at the time and saw the film that Michael Crichton had made called Rubbish, which had been made in that building. And I remember walking along George Street, because we walked all the way down to the Rocks, thinking, here I am walking alongside Jim Henson. Nobody knows him.
Goodness.
Because no one did know what he looked like then. He was probably, they got to see his image more because he did start appearing in interviews and things after that. So that was the first time he was here, and then he came again in 1984.
Yes.
And that's when he recorded the whole show.
becoming an artistic director of the Marionette Theatre of Australia, where this kind of theatre kind of struggles to exist now, it worked in the 80s, and you actually took over from Peter Screamer, who was... Scriven, sorry, who was the Tin Talkies. Tell me about him.
Well, Peter Scriven's a very important figure in Australian puppetry, and he had joined... Bill Nichols taught puppetry at Melbourne Teachers College and started a little puppet theatre in Melbourne, and also the Australian Puppet Guild in about 1944, I think, before the end of the war. And Peter Scriven had been a member of that guild. The interesting thing is Bill introduced puppetry as a subject for the intermediate certificate in Melbourne.
Wow.
And Peter sat for it and failed. Bill failed him because he didn't keep his practice book up to date or something. This is a great joke between them. Anyway.
Keep your logbooks, folks. Keep your logbooks up to date.
Bill is a very important figure. I should talk about him another time. But Peter was already interested in puppets then. And in 1953, with the help of the Arts Council of New South Wales, he presented a show at the Theatre Royal in Sydney, the old Theatre Royal. The following year, he did a second show, and those shows were taken on tour in between the theatre seasons. That brought his name to public attention, but it wasn't until 1956 when he launched a very large show at the new Elizabethan Theatre in Newtown, the Tin Talkies. When he had started building this show, or had the first idea to do it, someone knocked on his door, and it was Igor Hitchka, who was a Polish gentleman who had been after the war in Buenos Aires, where he worked with Padrecca. Padrecca's Italian company was a very large marionette company that did opera but also variety, travelled with its own orchestra and singers, as well as puppeteers. It was a big scale thing.
Yes.
And during the war, they didn't go back to Italy. They were based in Argentina. So here was this man, Igor, with a great expertise, having worked with a large marionette company, arriving just at the right time. And so he was very influential in the type of control they used, the bridge, the whole structure. And the show was very successful and toured in Australia. For many people in the country, it was their first theatrical experience to see these Tin Talkies. And Tin Talkies was quite a magic name. On 2GB, if you turn on the radio, they played the march from the Tin Talkies. Dun, 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 pom, 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 pom. So it was really big time.
Yeah, my parents actually mentioned that if you remember Richard Bradshaw, telling that we used to watch the Tin Talkies, and that's when we first got into puppetry, and I was like, wow, it really has made a legacy.
Yes, it was very big. And so Peter inherited a lot of money. His grandfather started the National Bank of Australia, so it was
wow.
So there was good genes there.
Yeah.
Anyway, Peter then did other productions. The Tin Talkies, if I'm right. No, it was the little fella Bindi that toured a big tour of Southeast Asia, something over a dozen countries, I think, for 6 months, a huge tour.
Yes.
And there's still a couple of people alive that were on that tour. Bruce Rowland up in Newcastle was on it. He was, I think, the youngest member, or nearly youngest. And so they had big impact there. There were posters in Cambodian script, in Japanese, in Korean. It was an extraordinary event. And I think the first of the really big tours that the Australian government funded. After that, the ballet went, I think. Then in 1964, if I've got the date right, the Marionette Theatre of Australia was formed as part of the Australian Elizabethan Trust, but with the support also of the Arts Council of New South Wales. And it got regular funding for these large shows from the government. And so that's really the beginning of significant government funding for puppetry in Australia, and that's thanks to Peter Scriven.
Wow.
And then they didn't have their own theatre base. They operated from the Elizabethan Theatre Trust building But in 1969, I think, yes, my first year out on tour with the Puppet Shadow Show, there was a big fire in the Trust warehouse in Botany, and those puppets were burnt.
Oh.
The only ones that survived were the puppets for the Explorers, which was out on tour at the time. So this was a great setback for Peter. And he went off to live in Asia. He lived in various countries, in Singapore, in India, in Sri Lanka, and lastly in the Philippines, gradually going through his money. So he ended up with very little in the before he died. Peter came back to Australia in about 1973, I think, to be the puppetry officer for the theatre board of the Australian Council for the Arts, as it was then. It's now the Australia Council.
Yes.
And that's where I first got to know him, although I had got his autograph in 1954.
Ah, so you were a fan.
Yes, definitely. And in fact, when I was in the States in 74, Peter helped me get to perform in the embassy in Washington. When I took over the Marionette Theatre, the new Tin Talkies was on tour in Asia, or just beginning to go on tour. It was not a particularly successful tour in terms of money, because they had a huge amount of equipment. I think 3 tons. The sound equipment was extraordinarily heavy. And they sometimes had to use more than one plane to go from one country to another. And the show, I have to be honest, was not as good as the original Tin Talkies. The first half used the soundtrack of the original Tin Talkies, and then a completely different soundtrack for the second half, and a different approach, which it didn't meld. It didn't quite gel with the first part. And I had hoped, in fact, it would have been a greater success for Peter. He endorsed my application to be the artistic director of the Marionette. He wasn't. He was just an advisor, then a guest director in 75, I think. And I had to come in, not do big shows, because there wasn't the money to mount a huge show, and touring had become very expensive. You had to pay living away allowances for all the actors. It became a big thing. So I started off with very basic shows, 2 shows, Ruse and the Hands. Ruse was a bit Tin Talkie-like in that we had songs and there was a story. It was about the Palmer Wallaby. It's a funny story in a way. The Palmer Wallaby was thought to be extinct in Australia, and then they discovered there was some living on Caroll Island near north of Auckland, and they'd been confused with the Dharma Wallaby, which looks a bit like the Palmer Wallaby. Anyway, they started exporting Palmer Wallabies back to Australia to
repopulate them. Yes.
And there's a New Zealand politician who said this animal must never be allowed to become extinct again. And anyway, they discovered after doing all this that the Palmer Wallaby was happily living up at Barrington Tops. It was endangered, but nowhere near extinct. So we did the story based roughly on that. It was a wallaby looking for a girlfriend going to New Zealand where there were Palmer wallabies. And then the other part of the program was called Hands, where it was just a series of short items, which began sort of with naked hands and then hands in gloves, and gradually the hands became puppets, and until finally there was a very large figure which was 3 sets of hands working.
Wow.
And I had a tour. This tour had been arranged before I joined the Marionette Theatre. I had a tour of Japan, as usual, and came back and looked at this show, and I thought, we can't do this at the Opera House. And I called the cast together, and I said, no, look, we'll do Ruse, and the second half I'll do my shadows. And they rebelled, because they'd had a lot of input into this show, Hands. So I called in the general manager and various people for the trust and said, what's your run-through? And they quite liked the show, so I thought, oh, well, we'll do it. Well, I still have the review there from Norman Caswell, that I think in the Telegraph or one of the papers, Hans is the most original sort of puppet show or something with me for a while. And he doesn't think much of ruse, but Hans was full of praise. And it took off. And that was a great lesson for me, that I'm not a perfect judge of puppet shows. It was an interesting experience altogether.
To have a community of puppeteers in Australia who are, working and creating work, it's really hard to market it now because we don't get the same amount of support and funding that we used to. And the age of puppetry that you're talking about is just so fascinating and foreign to me because it just doesn't. I find it so hard to find it now, and it's coming back.
It's a bit sad that the Marionette Theatre ended with not getting funding from the Australia Council. That's what happened. I would say that if the Marionette Theatre goes, your funding this is the one company that's getting all this funding. We were getting a large amount. And it was the major company. But so when it went, all that funding went. And I think the Theatre Board was quite happy to have more money to spend on other things.
And, puppetry is sort of slowly coming back, I think, in Australia. I think Netflix, The Dark Crystal, and a few of the latest sort of big blockbuster movies, Cooper and the T-String, Star Wars is bringing back a lot of traditional puppetry as opposed to animatronics or animation. And I'm really interested in the idea of what is happening in Sydney now is we've got Dead Puppet Society, not in Sydney, in Australia, and they are creating a couple of shows that have really been kind of blockbuster hits. Then you have Warhorse, which happened in sort of 2012 or maybe a little bit earlier, and these sort of major shows have kind of reshaped people's thoughts on puppetry, even though puppetry has existed in their lives from a foundation level with Sesame Street, with whichever kind of early childhood access they had to puppetry. It sort of leaves your conscious mind when you become an adult. And so now that these shows and also Avenue Q coming back is sort of reintroducing adults to puppetry, I'm hoping that this is now a new sort of wave or a new age of puppetry. But what do you think? Do you think that that's completely false and that puppetry has always existed and you just have to be able to find it? Or
things change because... and the world changes, technology changes, the audience's expectations change. And when television first began, puppeteers thought, this is going to be wonderful because puppets are small scale and will fit on the television. But in fact, marionettes on television don't work very well usually. You see how they're constructed, you see the strings, unless people are very careful. And marionettes worked very well in the 19th century when you couldn't see them very well, so the lighting was poor. So the audience imagined much more happening to the figure than actually saw. This is my theory anyway.
Yeah.
Because those big shows stopped once the electric light started coming in.
And you mentioned earlier about how television really did actually stuff puppetry up in a lot of ways.
Yes, well, there was a puppetry like the Muppets, which was devised for talking heads.
Yes.
And that was brilliant, a brilliant solution to keeping puppet alive. What they did was amazing.
Do you think Henson and the people who founded Sesame Street kind of had that in mind as an active choice, as an active decision, as an active solution, and that puppetry needed to change in order to fit television?
Before Jim went into puppetry, he was a filmmaker, and there is a film where he's painting an elephant or something that he made that has nothing to do with puppets. And then he and Jane started using puppets in Virginia, I think, commercially, I think for commercials, but maybe for short pieces. And then he moved into puppetry as a sole thing, but that wasn't his initial approach, so he was a filmmaker. In the same way, I think that I would have come into puppetry being interested in the theatre of it, not just straight into puppetry.
Yeah.
Yes, And it clearly has to change when you can use computer graphics and do amazing things, so you can animate a figure without actually having the figure exist. You know, that Sue did a workshop at Charleville with that sort of thing, I think. Sue Wallace.
I have to ask you, because you were a teacher, and I just find it really interesting that so many puppeteers and people who are interested in puppetry come from a teaching background. I wonder if you have a theory on why that might be.
No, I don't think I have a theory. Only in my case, that was just a separate profession that I chose in order to make money. There is an overlap in that there's an awful lot of mathematics that has gone into the making of the puppets, or some mathematical thinking. So it works that way. But I just think interesting people go into teaching.
And you've been revered by legends of the puppetry world, and Ronnie Burkett, who I'd say is a huge name in puppetry today, looks up to you and posted when you came to see his show recently.
I find that strange, because I look up to him, I think.
Well, that's my question. You look up to him. Do you look up to contemporary puppeteers, and you know, who do you look up to? I mean, obviously you might look up to Peter Screamin as well as sort of a founder of puppetry in Australia, but who are the people that you really respect and admire in the industry?
I certainly look up to Philip Huber, who is a marionettist based in Nashville, I think, and quite brilliant work. And you've put me on the spot thinking, because there are people whose work has really impressed me. There's a couple of guys from Buenos Aires, and I can't remember the name of the company at the moment, who did a wonderful Romeo and Juliet with glove puppets. And although I didn't understand the text, it was quite clear that the audience around me was enjoying it very much. It was quite erotic in places, because they undressed and you just got the naked hands with their heads on it. But it was a very funny show. I obviously tend to go for the humorous shows. And there, Albrecht Rosa, who was a marionettist that I helped to get to Australia, he did one show in each of the mainland capitals for the Trust organisers. This was in 1975, yes, when I was working on a puppet festival in Melbourne. And it was the opening, in fact, the time of the opening of the new Tin Talkies. And I had invited Albrecht Rosa just for people to see a different kind of marionette. Albrecht worked very slowly with the puppets. They were beautifully manipulated, wonderfully made. But he had a character, Gustav, that played the piano, and I cried with laughter each time I saw that. It was a wonderfully funny thing. As Gustav is playing the piano, he's on a stool, and the stool is slipping back from the piano, and Albrecht, the marionettist working him, just gently with his foot pushes the stool back towards the piano, and Gustav pushes the stool back to where it was. And Ingrid, who was Albrecht's assistant, got a little bit touchy with Gustav when he's asked for the stool to be put in one place, and she put it down. Then he changed his mind, put it in another place. She slammed it down, and Gustav came to her and lifted one finger of his hand. This is a marionette, towards her.
Wow.
You know, you behave. It was the hands, the fingers
Individual
were all
fingers.
full of sand. That was how they were heavy.
Wow.
But if you ever get a chance to see a video of his work, it's on one of the Henson series, the Albrecht Rosa.
Wow.
Gustav is marvellous. And then there was Granny, and Granny would be sitting the way knitting, as our friend is here, knitting and gossiping at the same time, and it would be local gossip. He would pick up stories when he arrived at the place. And when he was doing the show for the trust here, Granny was saying, "Oh, the Elizabethan Theatre Trust, such a big organisation. The big people ride in the cart and the little people push."
You've got a great memory. You really do. You have an amazing memory. You're so meticulous with your dates and you remember these details, which is such a fantastic thing to hear you recite sort of those details in the stories. We are out of time for this episode, Richard, but we are going to come back for part 2 in the next episode. So if you are listening with us today, please make sure that you check out part 2 of our episode. But for now, we are out of time. So Richard, I'm going to thank you for joining us today. And thanks for listening. And make sure you subscribe for more puppetry arts and practitioner interviews. I've been Pete Davidson. Check out part 2 and we'll be talking again soon.
Thanks for listening. Now we want to hear from you. Each week we'll post a series of questions related to every interview. Join the conversation on Twitter @TalkingSockCast. You can help us bring puppet power to the podcasting world by hitting subscribe, liking our socials and telling your friends. Like us on Instagram @OneOrangeSockProductions and check out our episode blog at oneorangesock.com. You can support our podcast by pledging to us on Patreon. Your support helps fund our audio mastering, interview transcriptions, and much, much more. Find the link in the podcast notes and earn yourself a shout out on our socials. Head to our website at oneorangesock.com or talk to us on Twitter to see how you can show your support. Our music is composed by Elizabeth Maniscalco and our cover art is by Chad Barnier. Without them, this podcast wouldn't be possible. We'll be back next week with another great episode here at Talking Sock.